In-person voting, underway. Will conclude this week. Make sure you check your local deadlines for that. Green Bay, for example, will end on Thursday. And remember, you're also going to see yet another state constitutional amendment on this spring ballot, this time asking voters to enshrine the current voter ID law in the state constitution. Now, the law requires a valid photo ID to vote in the state. And this is the second straight statewide election to have an amendment on the ballot dealing with voting. Remember, in November, voters approved changing the language for eligible voters from every U.S. citizen to only U.S. citizens. And we welcome in Brenna Gadar. She is a staff attorney at the State Democracy Initiative at the UW Law School. We visited with you before on other constitutional amendments. But as we look at this one, Brenna, what should voters really pay attention to in what they see on the ballot? In other words, the wording of this. Is there anything there that could trip them up?
So the big thing for voters to know is that this amendment isn't about whether or not we should have voter ID requirements. We already have those in state law. It's whether that requirement should be put specifically into the state constitution or not. And putting it there makes it a little bit more difficult to change the law down the road, and there are some sort of additional specifics to the amendment that you won't see on the ballot.
Those specifics, anything that people should be aware of before they go into the ballot so they know exactly what they're dealing with?
Yeah, so specifically the amendment details what types of IDs or who can issue IDs that are valid. The legislature can set requirements around which photo IDs specifically are valid, but they have to be issued by one of the entities listed in the amendment, which would include the state, tribes in the state, the federal government, and universities and colleges in the state.
All right, for those who aren't familiar, the history of the voter ID laws that are currently on the books, the statutes, passed in 2011, but a series of legal challenges delayed them going into effect until 2016. And as you mentioned, proponents of this constitutional amendment say this is to protect the voter ID law from perhaps future legal challenges. Does a constitutional amendment make something immune from future legal challenges?
It doesn't make it entirely immune, but it does reduce the chance of voter ID laws being ruled unconstitutional under the state constitution. So there are no legal challenges currently pending, but if somebody did want to challenge the existing voter ID laws again under the Wisconsin Constitution, that would become much more difficult if this Constitution itself also says that voter ID is okay and that voter ID is actually required.
If there was a challenge to a constitutional amendment, would that ultimately wind up in the Supreme Court? You mentioned that there are no challenges pending to the current statute, but it has been brought up in the Supreme Court race that it could possibly wind up in front of the High Court should it not be a constitutional ballot. Somewhat ironic that the two things are on the same ballot, but would it ultimately wind up there at the end road of any legal challenge? Would it be in the Supreme Court?
I think it's pretty likely for a case like that to make its way to the Wisconsin Supreme Court. The court takes up sort of major legal questions, and its primary role is in developing the law. And so if we did have a question about the constitutionality of voter ID, either the statute or the amendment, that would likely end up in the Wisconsin Supreme Court.
Brenna, is there any downside to this being a constitutional amendment for a law that's already in place? In other words, could something change in the future that all of a sudden you might need to address the language that's in this constitutional amendment, and then you don't really have as many recourses to do so? Is there a danger there?
It's definitely a possibility, and that is one of the drawbacks whenever something is added to the state constitution that needs to be considered. And opponents here in particular point to the fact that policies might evolve, technologies might evolve.
Sure.
And we might want to be able to respond more quickly to those changes in policy, because to change the law, you just need the legislature and the governor to pass a bill. To change the Constitution, you need an amendment to pass in 2 consecutive legislative sessions, and then it needs to go to the voters. So it takes a minimum of a couple years to change something that's in the Constitution, whereas a bill is much more adaptable.
Which leads me to my next question here. How do other states address this? We're not the first ones to have voter ID law. We're one of the stricter voter ID laws, I think, in the country, according to your research. Where does this put us with other states and how they deal with this issue?
Yeah, so it's pretty rare for states to actually put voter ID provisions in the state constitution. Voter ID itself is relatively common. There are 36 states with some type of voter ID law. As you mentioned, we have one of the stricter requirements. Some states have more flexibility if you don't have a photo ID for other options for casting your vote. But only 5 states actually have some sort of voter ID requirement in the state constitution. And Michigan has one on the other side prohibiting the imposition of strict voter ID requirements. But on the whole, this is a really rare thing for it to be actually in the Constitution itself, as opposed to in state statute.
Speaking of rare things, we are also kind of alone in how many constitutional amendments. When we last talked, we were talking about 7 in a less than 2-year span. This makes it 8. Concern about voter fatigue. We hear about that in elections, but when it comes to a constitutional amendment in a low turnout election, is that concerning?
I don't know how much voter fatigue is an issue, but I do think there are benefits to having these amendments on the ballot at major November even year cycles where there are going to be more voters seeing them. I think a lot of times voters aren't aware that there are actually even amendments on the ballot until they show up to the polling place. And so I think there is still some concern about voter education and how much voters are actually going to be turning out for this.
Well, we appreciate your time to help us educate those who will be going to the polls on April 1st. Brenna, thanks so much.
Thank you.